Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today, we'll review the journey of Mars and look ahead at Act 3 in his great struggle since really the middle of 2020. First off, I wanted to say thank you very much to all of my patrons who have been so supportive and encouraging. I really appreciate all of you. If you would like to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin, and you'll get early access to a number of my astrology and magic videos, as well as exclusive content that is not available to the general public. All right, now let's get started. As you might be aware, Mars has been engaged in a truly titanic struggle with the planets in Capricorn, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto since the middle of 2020. Well, his struggle is almost at an end, and it's actually going to come to its culmination point in January 2021. Let's talk about how we got here and what happens next. Now, as I go through this narrative, be aware that you can look at it on a couple of different levels. You can look at it from the perspective of your own life on a personal level, especially if you have strongly identified with Mars in 2020. For example, if he was your profected Lord of the Year, and so he had a special significance for you, and his transits really impacted you very strongly. This is one of the reasons that I strongly warned viewers away from acting like Mars in the second half of 2020, because Mars was going to be in, frankly, a lot of trouble. So, symbolically speaking, you did not want to take on martial qualities or walk into a martial situation. It's much better to have been Saturn, who represented that impermeable, impervious wall, rather than Mars, who was vainly trying to knock it down. Now, we can also look at this narrative in the light of collective events or world events. If we have a person or a group who's behaving either like Mars or Saturn, we can follow their story through Mars' narrative, and we'll know what happens next because we already see the entire story playing out right in the sky, or in our ephemeris, as the case may be. So let's review the story of Mars. I divided it into 3 acts like a good play or a story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So in Act 1, Mars entered Aries in 2020, in the middle of 2020, ready for a fight. He is in his own domicile here, and so he's extra Marsy and fighty. He really was spoiling for a fight, as they say. Very soon thereafter, in August 2020, Mars in Aries squared that trio in Capricorn that I described. First Jupiter, then Pluto, and finally Saturn. If you go back to my August video forecast, this was really the first salvo by Mars. You can think of him symbolically as a soldier or an army besieging a walled city. Now, of the 3 phases of Mars' attempted storming of the Capricorn walls, Mars was actually the best positioned in Act 1. At this point, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto were all retrograde while Mars was direct, so he had a little bit of an advantage. They still had additional strengths that I'll describe in a second, but this was about as good as it was going to get for Mars. Now, as I discussed extensively in my previous Mars square Saturn videos, which you can also view on YouTube, Mars was doomed to lose ultimately in these encounters, and this is because of 3 factors. 1, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are all naturally superior planets to Mars because they are slower. And in the traditional conception of planetary strength, slower planets, at least those that are naturally slower, not when they're retrograde or something, planets that are naturally slower have much more powerful, long-lasting, and consequential impacts than planets that are fast. Mars is the fastest out of all of these planets. Therefore, he's kind of the lightest weight, if you will. The other reason Mars is doomed to lose is because in the square between Aries and Capricorn, Capricorn is in the overcoming position. So planets there will dominate planets that are in Aries, all things being equal. And then finally, Saturn in Capricorn particularly is very strong by sign. So in Mars's future attempts to win, especially as he got into Acts 2 and 3, Mars was either going to be retrograde and therefore weakened, or later in January, as we'll talk about in a minute, Mars will have moved into his detriment, Taurus, so he's going to be very weakened as well. All this time, he's fighting against Saturn, who this entire time is in his domicile, first Capricorn, then Aquarius. As you can see, the outcome of this battle, in my opinion, was a foregone conclusion. Now in Act 2, Mars stationed retrograde in September 2020, and he lost a lot of potency that way because planets that are moving retrograde are thought to be moving against nature in the traditional terminology, and therefore they are much weaker in comparison to planets that are moving direct. This time, the shoe was really on the other foot compared to Act 1. Mars turned retrograde and in late September squared Saturn, who was just then stationing direct. And, whenever we have a planet that is stationing either retrograde or direct, it represents a shift in the prevailing conditions. So this was a real turning point in that Mars battle, showing Mars and the rest of the world that things were not going to go as easily as he may have thought. Mars is often guilty of being overly confident. Well, here, his confidence, if he were smart, was going to start to be a little bit shaken. Then in early October, Mars squared Pluto and then Jupiter, both of whom were now direct. So again, shoe is on the other foot. Mars is now retrograde. All of these other planets that he is seeking conflict with were all direct. So the tide had very clearly turned against Mars in Act 2, like in any good movie or play or book. So now, let's look at what lies ahead in so-called Act 3. Act 3, again, as in any good story, is the finale. It's really the nail in the coffin of Mars' great adventure. It's not exactly a surprise twist. It's more like a full unfoldment of the consequences of failure, right? This is kind of the very end and its aftermath. I think it will be surprisingly quick because all of that Mars action is basically over by the third full week of January 2021. So let's look at January. Mars's first and very dramatic failure is going to really begin the beginning of the end, if you will. This is January 6th. This is the date that Mars departs from his domicile Aries and enters directly into his detriment Taurus. So for any planet to have that occur to them is really devastating. It's a major loss of potency and power. We saw something similar happen last year the year before last, with Jupiter leaving Sagittarius, his domicile, and going straight into his fall in Capricorn. Same concept. It's just a really drastic change for a planet. It's like going from the apex of power directly into the darkest dungeon. So this is going to be a very extreme turnabout for Mars. January 13th, on the heels of this, is Mars' last encounter with Saturn. Now Mars has actually squared Pluto back in very late 2020, and now Mars is going to square Saturn. Saturn has moved into his diurnal and preferred domicile Aquarius, so he's even stronger here than he was when he was in Capricorn. Now, he is direct, and compared to Taurus, Aquarius is still a superior sign. So again, Saturn is still in place. He has all those advantages that he enjoyed in 2020 and maybe a little bit more because of that change of sign into his preferred sign. It's going to be a pretty uneven battle, and Mars is, I would say, severely outgunned. January 20th, Mars will conjoin Uranus in Taurus, with Uranus basically stationary. The slower a planet naturally is, the longer its stationary period is going to be. Uranus is pretty darn slow, and of course its station lasts quite a number of days. So his official station had occurred some days prior, but he's basically not moving on January 20th. So this is going to be what I would call the final flame out of Mars. It's a dramatic and maybe even violent defeat of Mars's entire project. It's a little hard to know, I think, at this stage, whether we're talking self-immolation, is Mars setting himself on fire to make a point, or is he just incompetent, or is somebody helping him? We don't really know that. But it's going to be a pretty dramatic finale for all of this drama that we've been watching for over 6 months now. January 22nd is really Mars's last major aspect in this entire story. This is when Mars squares Jupiter in Aquarius. And I think that in many ways, it's the perfect aspect to end Mars's entire story. Jupiter represents balance, moderation, and above all, justice. He represents balance in society as well as inward spiritual balance. So if we think of the last half year as Mars going on a warpath, this square is basically Mars being brought to account for all the cities, so to speak, that he burned on his war campaign, metaphorically speaking. So if we review, let's summarize what we've seen so far. Mars, on his entry into Aries, decided to go on a campaign of aggression, all-out war, against what I call the Wall. And the Wall is, of course, the group of planets that were in Capricorn, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. The first attempt in Act 1 went reasonably well for Mars. The second attempt made it pretty clear this wall had no intention of falling and was actually kind of like fighting back, if that's possible for a wall to do. And I think provided the first realization that Mars could easily lose this. The third attempt, Act 3, isn't so much even an attempt at winning as just watching Mars fall apart and flame out. In many ways, the defeat has already occurred, right? That's already in the past. Act 3, what we're going to be seeing in January, is just a very overt or public way for Mars to come crashing down. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.